What's good everybody, this is CP and welcome back to another fantasy basketball video. Today I'll take a look at a list of potential deep league sleepers and possible waiver wire pickups who might be able to give your teams the extra edge to win it all later this season. Obviously some of these names might not pan out, but if you have an injury prone team or an extra flyer spot to run, they might be worth a gamble. So let's not waste any more time and 走起吧.
Yeah.
Sadiq Bey might be a sneaky versatile wing to keep an eye on, especially in deeper leagues. The Pistons' 19th overall pick is quietly coming into his own as an NBA rookie. With limited playing time averaging just over 20 minutes a night, he has shown the ability to return some value for his owners in points, triples, rebounds, and steals. Looking at the Pistons roster right now, he looks like he has quietly secured a rotational role as one of the key players to come off the bench. At the same time, the Pistons seems to be high on his development. So if the Pistons do decide to play him more, I wouldn't be surprised to see Bey average closer to around 25 to 27 minutes a night later in the season. At the same time, the Pistons roster isn't particularly deep at the wing position. So I think a player like Bey could step in and get more usage and playing time for development, especially when the Pistons do decide to shut down veterans like Blake Griffin and Derrick Rose later in the season. Because of that, there's upside for Bey to average around 12.5 points a night along with 2 triples, 4.5 rebounds, and around 1 steal per game. On top of that, he has potential to have some big nights for the Pistons down the stretch. Isaac Okoro of the Cleveland Cavaliers is another rookie you might want to keep an eye on in the coming months. Fantasy-wise, he hasn't had the best start compared to others from his draft class, but he did put together a nice stretch of games where he was able to return late round value in standard 9 category leagues. Right now his fantasy upside is uncertain, but he has shown the ability to be a contributor in 6 of the major fantasy categories, including points, steals, triples, blocks, rebounds, and assists. Surprisingly, the Cavs haven't been capping Okoro's minutes early on, as we saw him go through a stretch where he played more than 33 minutes a night consistently. From the look of it, Cleveland seems to love his motor and defensive game, and this should keep him on the floor as the season goes on. Overall, Okoro's minutes looks pretty safe at the wing position, without much heavy competition. At worst, I see him coming off the bench, but he should still average just over 25 minutes a night. At his best, Okoro seems like a player who can give you around 12 points along with 2 steals, 1.5 triples, and close to 1 block per game. As a bonus, I don't think he will hurt you too much with his shooting. Obviously, his usage and field goal attempts per game might be limited once Sexton and Garland comes back, but in deeper leagues, I feel like Okoro might be a sneaky flyer to pick up for multi-category upside. Cole Anthony of the Orlando Magic is another potential deep league sleeper I would keep an eye on at the point guard position. With Markelle Fultz done for the year, Anthony was handed the golden opportunity to take over as the team's starting point guard. Fantasy-wise, he hasn't seized the opportunity yet, but we can't forget that he is barely into his rookie season, so like many first-year players, we should expect some growing pains with owning Anthony. But aside from that, Anthony's stats show some potential as he was able to contribute in points, rebounds, assists, and steals and had a couple of nice games. At the same time, I think the Magic's backcourt is pretty thin right now. If they don't make any big trades to improve their squad later this season, I'm not sure if there will be anyone who can take over Cole Anthony's ball handling duties. To me, Anthony's field goal percentage might be an issue for some teams, so he might be a better fit for those not concerned about shooting percentages. But at his best, I feel like Anthony could surprise some people on some nights and put up a stat where he averaged around 13 points, 1.5 triples, 5 rebounds, just over 4 assists, and over 1 steal per game. If Anthony is able to improve on his efficiencies, I think he might have a chance to push into the top 150 to finish off the season. Patrick Williams of the Chicago Bulls is another young player with sleeper potential in the coming months. So far this season, he has dealt with inconsistency issues, but we also saw a small stretch of games where he was able to score over 14 points, 4 rebounds, along with 1 steal, 1 block, and over 2 triples per game. Even though his fantasy stats might not translate every night, Williams seems like one of the more NBA-ready first-year players to enter the league. At this point, I feel like his fantasy situation is pretty good in Chicago. Simply put, the minutes have been there, as he has been able to average over 25 minutes a night. Moving forward, the team should continue to give chance to develop. If you were to ask me, I feel like he is the only wing in Chicago with the most upside, since we have probably seen the best of Otto Porter Jr., so I don't see him as a legit threat to take over a bunch of Williams minutes. Even at 100% healthy, I feel like the Bulls are ready to move on from Porter Jr. So in an ideal situation, things could really open up for Williams in the second half of the season. Optimistically speaking, we could see him average closer to 30 minutes a night. To be fair, his game definitely needs some work, but when he is hot, he could help contribute some triples, blocks, steals, and is a decent rebounder for his position. Right now, I don't think he is a must-own player in standard 12-team leagues, but he could be a great gamble for teams in deeper leagues to stash, especially if you have an extra flyer or IR spot available. Gary Trent was one of the more hyped breakout players entering this season, but he hasn't exactly blew things out of the water yet. However, moving forward, he might be able to turn things around quickly. It helps that the Blazers will be without Nurkic and McCollum for a little while. At the same time, Dame Lillard can't take all the shots in Portland every night, so he might have to rely on a shooter like Trent Jr. to do some scoring as well. Just looking at his stats, we can tell that Trent Jr. has the ability to occasionally drop good stats and can be a difference maker for teams that need scoring and triples. Out of everyone on this list, he might be one of the best shooters. And seeing his per 36 minute stats, he could average around 17 points and close to 3 triples a game on a very good night. Roster wise, Portland doesn't have the deepest bench right now, so if Trent Jr. gets hot, he could be one of the primary bench scoring options the Blazers will depend on down the stretch. The last time I checked, he is not owned in too many Yahoo leagues, so it might be worthwhile to take a chance on him with your last roster spot. As the season goes on, it might be a little bit harder to find scoring on the waiver wire, so someone with Trent Jr.'s potential to give you 16 to 20 points a night might be harder to find. Going even deeper, I would keep an eye on a young player like Isaiah Roby of the OKC Thunder. If we look at the OKC Thunder's roster, Roby is one of those fantasy players that could benefit from a starter resting or possibly being traded. Right now, it seems like Al Horford is the only player in the way of Roby's fantasy outbreak. If he's able to take over Horford's starting minutes, he could be one of the biggest risers in the coming months. The sample size we have right now is extremely small, but from the looks of it, Roby can be a low-end double-double threat who can also give your teams an extra boost in triples and blocks. Even if OKC decides to slightly bump up Roby's minutes, he could still see around 25 a night, and could be someone worth keeping, especially if you have an injury-prone team or play in a deep competitive league without much on the waiver wire. So with that in mind, I would keep a close eye on Roby and the OKC situation and see how things play out with Al Horford. Realistically, I think it could play out two ways for Horford. For one, they might be able to move him out and get rid of his contract. On the other hand, they simply might just reduce his playing time in the second half and give a young player like Roby a chance to develop and eat up his fantasy stats later in the season. So with that in mind, I wouldn't be surprised to see Roby quietly become a top 140 to 150 fantasy player later on. For 15 years of good luck in fantasy basketball, make sure you like this video within the next 5 seconds. I wouldn't risk it.